You wrote, Theodore, Anthony, there has been a long march not just through the institutions but through the minds of the young. When young people want to praise themselves, they describe themselves as non-judgmental. For them, the highest form of morality is amorality. That's quite clear. What are, in your eyes, the consequences for a society of widespread non-judgmentalism?
Well, non-judgmentalism is, of course, inherently hypocritical and self-contradictory, because, of course, if you think that not making a judgment is a good thing to do or not to do, then you are making a judgment. So my point would be that making judgments is part of our existence. We can't, I don't think we could live, I don't know how long, I haven't timed it, but I don't think we can live for very long without making judgments. And the problem with judgments is, of course, that they sometimes turn out to be wrong. So you mustn't be inflexible in your judgments. But that's not the same, and many of your judgments will be wrong. But that's not the same as saying, I'm getting rid of judgment altogether, because you can't. And if you claim to do something that you can't do, then you are turned into a liar. Essentially, you're turned into a liar. You're lying about yourself. You're lying about what you really think. So a society of liars is a society that is, first of all, it's very unpleasant. It's a society in which the most ruthless people will come to the top. And it's a society in which people will be very easily manipulated. So so the claim that we don't make a judgment is nonsense. It's nonsense and intellectual. It's also, of course, self-congratulatory. It's hypocritical and self-congratulatory. It's false. And actually, at heart, it's ridiculous.
What do you think's behind it? Is it, picking up on that self-congratulatory point, is it a kind of moral narcissism? Is it a cowardice, not wanting to not wanting to judge a culture which you actually may well have decided is inferior in some way? What is it that drives people to be non-judgmental?
Well, there's cowardice is a very important element of it. So that, for example, I would say the medical profession is very cowardly with regard to the problem of addiction, particularly to opiates. The addiction to, I mean, it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but everything I say is a bit of a hobby horse. But we have, for example, turned addiction to opiates into a kind of illness which is in the same category, shall we say, as multiple sclerosis or motor neuron disease. It's something that just happens and you don't make a contribution to it. But this is obviously false. And what we are trying to do by saying that it's just an illness is to exculpate completely the person who is addicted. And the reason for that is you don't want to seem horrible or censorious. The most terrible thing you can say about anybody now is that he is censorious. Now, censoriousness is an unpleasant attribute or characteristic. There's no doubt about that. And you can easily make a very wrong judgment. I'll give you an example of a very wrong judgment of mine. I mean, it didn't result in any tragedy or anything like that. But I was on a bus recently, and it was a bus journey that took about 45 minutes. And there was a young woman, a rather beautiful young woman, in front of me. And she was dolling herself up the whole way. I mean, I don't know how you can spend 40 minutes dolling yourself up with various paints and powders and things like that, but that's what she did. And in the end, inwardly, I didn't say anything, of course, but I was rather irritated. I thought, this is terrible. You know, what kind of culture is this in which people spend 40 minutes dolling themselves up in this ridiculous way. And then she got off the bus before me at a bus stop before I was going to get off. And she was actually smartly dressed. But I saw, as soon as she got off, that she had a terrible withered leg and that she was limping terribly. And so that actually walking was a huge effort for her, really. And it wasn't something she could just take for granted. And suddenly I saw the tragedy of her existence, in fact. And I understood then why making herself up might be so enormously important to her. And so my initial judgment was wrong. And it was hasty. And I'm sure I will make it again if I see it again, the same kind of thing. People are so afraid of being wrong and hasty in that way that they claim not to want to make any judgment. And in order to not to make any judgment, they turn what is a moral question into one that is simply a physiological one.
Yes.
And that comes from a certain cowardice because they don't want to be wrong. Because, as I said, censoriousness is an unpleasant characteristic.
This is something I've seen a lot. I've got my own experience with people who've dealt with issues that are to do with addiction, specifically alcohol. And a lot of people within my milieu, as it were, took the line of, well, it's an illness. And it was a sensitive time over many years. And you don't necessarily want to come across as the heartless person who suggests that there is agency on the part of the other person, that it wasn't that they just landed in that position. And it's a hard pill for people to swallow, I think, because when people are suffering, you must feel like you don't want to turn the screw, and yet I think we try to avoid the evidence of our eyes and ears. And sometimes I wonder whether this links back to this skepticism point or this destruction of the old order, because I suppose if you go and walk around any of our Gothic cathedrals or churches, you can go and find the 7 deadly sins chiseled into the wall, the dance with death, your final judgment, as it were, this idea that you have to answer to something beyond yourself at the end of your times. And in many cases, it's trying to push you quite forcibly onto the path of virtue and say, you're a worthless sinner. And I suppose therapy culture that has sprung up in the place of that old way of seeing runs counter to that. It says, no, that was actually really deleterious to the human mind, and actually it's better that we just accept there are things out of our control. But I'm not too sure I see the benefit for each of us in denying this agency, because then it almost makes it look like we have no say whatsoever in how our existence pans out or how we respond to the cards that were dealt, even if they're hard.
Yes, I mean, that, of course, hands power over to other people, of course. I mean, if you have no agency, then someone must act on your behalf. I mean, one has to be, as I said, censoriousness is very unpleasant. And in the 1920s, for example, people were still, unwed mothers were still put in mental hospitals for having had a child out of wedlock, which was then regarded as something outrageous to do. And there was a lot of censoriousness about it. And that was very unpleasant because, in particular, and this strikes me as terribly cruel and stupid, the child itself was blamed for the fact that it was illegitimate. I mean, that happened. And that's terrible. On the other hand, if you have a society in which people don't care where their children come from, as it were, I used to interview 16-year-old children or adolescents. If you ask them who their father was, would say, "Well, do you mean my father at the moment?" Or they would simply deny that they had one. So they were, I suppose, children of virgin birth or something. But anyway, it was so self-evident to me that this is catastrophic socially, and that it leads to the state being father to the child, in fact. This is catastrophic. That it seemed to me that we've lost the ability to tread between, on the one hand, being horribly censorious, and on the other hand, denying people any agency, any moral agency. And so you're constantly having to estimate and so on. If you take things like drug addiction or addiction in general, of course, it has medical consequences. And the doctor doesn't say to the patient, you are responsible for your situation, depart my sight and never come back, whatever your situation, because it's all your own silly fault. You don't say that. But on the other hand, if you deny someone their agency, then you deny them the possibility of contributing to their overcoming of their own personal problem, which is a lie, and is a lie, incidentally. It's a lie.